首先自我介绍一下，我是University of Connecticut 我叫杨春生，我是负责我们 CLTA 这个2语音教学研究的 SIT 的这个小组。首先我想介绍一下我们这个小组，因为我们是一个比较专门的 specialized 的一个 group， 所以呢，跟其他的小组相比，我们的讲座呀活动并不多，但是我们会不定期的根据大家的需要，或者我们几个负责人的认为有必要的话，我们会举行一些讲座和讨论。那今年的1月份呢，我们会有2个讲座，一个是今天的周毅老师，还有23号我们请了南卡的刘江老师，分别讲这个语音方面的，一个是理论一点点的，一个是实践的教学。我们这个 SIG 有4位老师负责，我还有中山大学的杨贝老师，还有 George Washington 的张航老师，还有南卡的刘江老师。所以呢，我知道有的老师并不是我们这个 group 的成员，如果有兴趣呢，欢迎加入我们，好吧？关于周老师呢，他一会儿会做自我介绍，那我稍微说几句。周老师其实以前也是我们的中文老师，有很多年的教学经验。然后他是马里兰大学的博士，现在 Penn State 做博士后研究，而且周老师近几年在这个很多高端的2语学的杂志上发表了很多文章，比如 Language Learning、Study Second Language Acquisition、Bilingualism， 还有我们的学会的杂志上呢，周老师也发表过文章。好，今天他讲的题目是 Foreign Accented Mandarin。Is it all about tones, right? 周老师会用英文来讲但是我们在讨论的时候呢，我们可以用中文，也可以用英文。好，那我们就请周老师讲。好，周老师。
All right, thank you. And thanks everyone for taking time out of your Thursday night to come and listen. I'm happy to have a chance to talk about this topic as it's one that's personally very meaningful to me as a foreign accented Mandarin speaker. When I speak Mandarin tonight, you'll get a chance to hear some of that. So the topic is foreign accented Mandarin, and I just added it's all about tones, right? Whenever we think about second language Mandarin, we're often focused on, especially pronunciation, we're focused on tones. So it's kind of natural that when we think about foreign accented Mandarin, we also think about the role of tones. But this question is kind of hinting at a joke that no, it's definitely not. The answer is no, it's definitely not all about tones. It's about a lot of things, but tones are part of Chinese and so they're important. And they're also part of Chinese that is somewhat unique. And so it's been a lot of a focus for research. So we'll think about tones quite a bit this evening, but nobody should think that when we talk about foreign accented Mandarin, it's only about tones. All right. Let's see. So just to introduce myself in case you aren't familiar with me, if we haven't met before, my name's Eric Pelzl, Chinese name Zhou Yi. And I started learning Mandarin about 2003 when I went to China to teach English in the city of Wenling, which is a little bit south of Shanghai. Spent about 3 years in China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, and then came back to the US and taught Chinese at a small private college in Wisconsin, Wisconsin Lutheran College. During that 6 years that I was teaching there, I had the opportunity to go to Middlebury, first as a master's student in the MA program, and then as a Chinese teacher in the summers in 2011 and 2012. So that's really my experience, kind of the high point and high intensity of my experience as a Chinese language learner and teacher. And since 2012, then I've kind of moved into a second phase of my relationship with Chinese, which is as a researcher. I would still love to keep learning and teaching Chinese, but those opportunities haven't been presented to me since 2012. So I've been focusing instead on doing research into second language perception of tones. That was my dissertation. And now as a postdoc at Penn State, I'm doing research on how native Chinese listeners perceive second language tones. And so that's really what I'm going to be sharing with you tonight. And before we get going, we just need to say that this is a pretty new area of study for Mandarin. So some of the things I'm going to be telling you are kind of speculative or guessing about what the future might hold. And we don't have a lot of very clear answers to some of our big questions just yet. But I'm hoping tonight that you will get an idea of how to think about foreign accent in general, and especially in Mandarin. So our first question to try and answer is, what is a foreign accent? There's been research on accent stretching back for decades, right? And some of the clearest results from that is that adults who learn new languages typically have a foreign accent. So there is nothing strange or abnormal about having a foreign accent if you start learning a new language as an adult. That's normal, that's natural. It's also not usually a problem. Speakers who speak with an accent can often be very comprehensible to listeners. Right? And even when people have rather strong accents, uh, humans are very good at adapting to foreign accented speech. And so with some practice and experience listening to somebody, we usually get much better at understanding them. But what is a foreign accent in Chinese? Well, to start with a personal perspective on this, the last time I was in China, I have two stories I'm going to share with you. Right. So in 2019, spring of 2019, I was in Beijing. And the first story I want to share is I went into Xingbake, right, and ordered coffee. And I did it all in Chinese. And when I got the cup, this is what it said, right? Mr. Y. I was very happy and amused by this, but I think it holds a lesson about what it means to be a second language and foreign accented speaker in Chinese, and that is that even without opening my mouth, people have an impression of me that is, I am not a native speaker of Chinese. Right? This is true for many of the students in our classrooms. Of course, there's the opposite pattern that's also true for many of our students. If they look Chinese, before they open their mouths, people's assumption is that they will not have any type of foreign accent, right? And so as we think about accented speech, we have to keep in mind that there are these assumptions on the part of listeners which we can't do anything about. Right? I cannot and you cannot change the ways of thought of all the people in China, right? So that is not something we can do much about as teachers. On the other hand, it is something we need to be aware of, right? Uh, However, the flip side about China, which I think is maybe different than a place like the United States, is that on the phone, I often do get to pass as a native speaker. Last time I was in China, I ordered a package, and when Kuaidi came to drop it off, he gave me a call to find out where I was. I told him, and he could sense, I guess, that something wasn't quite normal in my accent, but his assumption was I must be a native speaker. And so as he was about to hang up, he said, "Eh, 你是东北, 你是山东人吧?" Right? So he could tell I wasn't from Beijing, but he didn't know exactly where. Um, so that gets us something important about the language learning context, the foreign accent context in China, which is that there are lots of local varieties of accents in China. Right? So because of all of the different fangyan, the different dialects and regional types of speech, people don't expect that every time you speak Mandarin, you're going to sound one way, right? Even within this big group here, we see of Mandarin, right? A speaker from Harbin and a speaker from Chengdu are going to sound quite different, right? And so we have this expectation when we're speaking Mandarin that there's actually quite a bit of flexibility in what people are willing to accept as native Mandarin. Okay, so this gets us to the point of trying to then pinpoint what is it that we mean when we talk about a foreign accent in Chinese. That is, how is a foreign accent different than these regional accents? And to get us there, I'm going to talk just a little bit about kind of the science and theory of speech, right? So one thing that we know about speech is that every time we produce a word, it sounds a little bit different, right? So even though to us as listeners, we hear the same word, like here, this is these are actually 5 different times where I said the word bee in English, like buzz, buzz, bee, right? Um, each of the physical sound waves that travel through the air is a little bit different. We can record those and measure those and draw them out, and they all look a little bit different, even though to our ears, they really sound quite similar, right? So this similarity that we hear is something we learn to hear. As a group of speakers, as a group of listeners, we come to recognize certain sounds as being part of a group, a category. And when we hear those sounds, then we think of them as belonging to that category. Thinking about this can help us start to think about what it means to be a foreign accented speaker. We can draw out these different dimensions of speech and start to give us an image, a picture in space of what the sounds that we hear are. I'm not telling you here what these 2 dimensions are. I'm leaving it kind of abstract, mathematical, right? But this is as deep as the math gets right here, right? We have an X dimension and a Y dimension so that we can draw horizontally and vertically and put our sounds into this space. Those sounds, right, those 2 dimensions could be lots of things. It could be how long a word is, its duration, how loud or quiet it is, right? It could be the pitch, could be something about the vowel quality. We can map all of those things out in dimensional space. As long as we can measure them, then we can map them out, right? And so when we start mapping them out, what we get is for each sound we map, we put a point in this space, and we see that those points here, right, for E and Ah, these 2 sounds, are quite far away from each other, right? Now, this is just one instance, one time of saying E and one time of saying Ah. But like I just said, when we speak, we actually, each time we say those sounds, they're a little bit different, right? So if I said ah, 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 you'd start to see that maybe they aren't quite exactly the same, right? But they kind of all stick together around the same space. So the E sounds are over here, the ah sounds are over there. And if we had lots of instances of saying those words, or maybe lots of people saying those sounds, we'd start to see that there's sort of a circular shape, right? And this is what we're going to call a distribution, right? Kind of the spread, the pattern of that sound in space. Right? And so we have a distribution for here, 2 different vowel categories, the E category and the Ah category. And I think this is helpful as we think about what it means to be a foreign accented speaker, because what's different isn't any individual time that I say a sound, it's the pattern for how I say those sounds, right? So maybe sometimes when I say the vowel ah is in ma, mama, right? Sometimes that vowel sounds very native-like. And so there are instances that are kind of in the distribution of a native speaker's ah, but maybe overall, because of my native English language influence, my production is a little bit different, right? So it's this distribution of the sound that is different and uniquely different because of the influence of my native language, right? So this is how I'm going to help us start thinking about what a foreign accent is. I'm going to stop showing all those individual dots and just look at circles. And these circles are the distribution, right, of these sounds. Okay. So as we think about foreign accent, we have these distributions that are slightly different for the foreign accented speaker, right? Sometimes maybe it's similar, but often it's just a little bit outside of what's expected, what's normal for a native speaker. Importantly, we can think about this as being foreign accented pronunciation and pronunciation errors. So for foreign accented speakers, it's not just that the sounds we make when we're speaking our non-native language are a little bit accented. Sometimes they are actually wrong, either because we don't have control of the language or just the influence of our native language is very strong and so makes the sound kind of incorrect for the listener. So I'm going to sketch out three different types, ways we can think about this. So there's first what I'm going to call accent shifted, which is really just accented speech, right? But I'm using the word shifted to remind us that it's moving that distribution. It's shifted away from the target. So here A is our native language, our standard, our target, and A prime here is that shifted category. So this is an accented sound. And we could think of this in a specific instance. So maybe when I, as a non-native speaker, say lu, and if I say it a whole bunch, lu, 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 maybe, it may not be quite native-like, but it's not so far off. It's kind of accented. We can contrast that with what's much more like an error, right? And one that probably you hear a lot if you're a teacher of English speaking students of Mandarin, right? Instead of saying lu, they say lu, right? They get the vowel completely wrong because of the influence of English, because we don't have this yu sound, right? And so here, what's happening is they're very consistent, right? But they're consistently making an error. Right? So we have these accent shifted sounds. We also have these systematic sounds that are kind of predictably and repeatedly incorrect, but in a certain way. And then there's one more way that errors can happen that's very important when we think about tones. It may not be so obviously important when we think about vowels and consonants, and that is what I'm calling unsystematic errors, where instead of just producing one different sound, the learner kind of flips back and forth between different sounds, kind of randomly uses one sound and then another sound and another sound. You can think of this a little bit with lu, where sometimes learners say lu and sometimes maybe they say li as they're trying to get to that lu sound and they don't hit it, and they kind of use both of these extremes, right? But that's not too common for vowels. In a moment, we'll see it's pretty common. At least it seems like it'll be pretty common for tones. So what are foreign accented tones? Well, we know Mandarin has these four tones, right? High, rising, low, falling, tone 1, 2, 3, 4. We know that those tones can affect the meanings of words. They don't always affect the meaning of words. I think that's important to remind us, right? Not every syllable in Mandarin is like ma. Sometimes we have nung, right? Where the only word we know is nung. There is no nung, nung, or nung in standard Mandarin, right? So it's not always the case that these tones create lexical problems, but they often do. Uh, and we can see that there are the same possibilities for tone errors and tone accents as what we saw with vowels and consonants. So we can have an accent shifted tone. Maybe when a student is producing ta, they just do it too high. I remember I had students who would start out their sentences with ta, like really way up there, right? Probably not a very natural sound. Um, that might be part of their accent, right? Or maybe too low. And for each of the tones, this could happen in a different way. So maybe for lu, they would say lu, right? And it's just a little too low or something. It's not quite right, but it's still recognizably a falling tone. Right? We can contrast that with a systematic tone error, where now they are swapping right out an inappropriate tone category. So maybe instead of saying lu, they consistently say lu, right, with a high tone. This probably isn't something that you hear too much in, native English speaking students, but it might be something that's quite common for tonal language speakers. So say a Vietnamese student who's learning Mandarin might make this type of error where certain tones from Vietnamese interfere in the way they perceive Mandarin tones, and so they tend to make very consistent errors in that area. But finally, what I think is quite common among our students who are English speakers or speak other non-tonal languages is this type of unsystematic tone error, where instead of the tone that ought to be produced, they kind of sometimes produce a low tone or a rising tone or a falling tone. They kind of produce all of the tones, and maybe from one sentence to the next, or one day, one conversation to the next, they might actually make completely different errors for the same word, right? So one time, lu is said as lu, the next lu, the next lu, because they just don't know what the tone ought to be, right? So this is, I think, a helpful way to think about the types of tone errors that our students can make, and just in general, the type of pronunciation difficulties that learners might have when they're trying to learn a second language, right? One other thing to say about tone errors is there is this other thing which could be either systematic or unsystematic. That is, it could happen with a pattern or not, which is some weird tone that doesn't exist in Mandarin. Again, this might be more likely if the learner comes from a tonal language where maybe some tone that doesn't exist in Mandarin influences the way they produce their Mandarin tones. Right. I'm going to move now to think about the research a little bit more. And even though I just presented this, I have to say that apart from my own research, right, this is a pretty new idea. So there haven't been people doing research on, say, foreign accented tones, these accent shifted tones, or unsystematic errors previously, because we didn't have that idea. At least I'm not aware of that idea, right? So it's a kind of a new way to think about these things, but we can look back at the research that's been done and think about how these different types of pronunciation might apply. Right, so what does this mean for L2 Mandarin speakers? Well, we know not so much from research, but from experience as teachers in classrooms that our learners certainly speak and produce the consonants and vowels of Mandarin with an accent. So a word like yu is often said as yo or you, right? They'll just misproduce it that way, and it takes them maybe quite a while to realize that that sound is not you in English, right? But it should be a different sound. And there can be some systematic effects to these types of errors, where maybe ch is consistently said as ch, or maybe the reverse, where instead of saying, right, they want a ch, they say ch, or jiang is said as jiang. Again, probably more likely that jiang is said the same as zhang. These types of kind of systematic mispronunciations do happen in our errors among our L2 learners, but so far there hasn't been a lot of research on this because people are more interested, I think, in research in tones. And for tones, we have a lot of research, not quite as much on production as on perception, but we do have a lot of research on production. And one thing that comes through clear is that learners do make a lot of errors. In one study, Chen et al., it was with a bunch of beginning learners. They were just reading single syllables of Chinese, and they made errors on over 30% of the single syllable tones that they read out, right? But even for advanced learners, these types of tone errors persist. In research I did, we found that for advanced learners, about 22% of the words that they knew had incorrect tones in their minds, right? So this is something I definitely know is true for myself. When I'm reading a book, I'm often reading and I'll come across a word that I can pronounce. I know the meaning for it, but I have no idea what the tones are. And this is true, at least in our study, for about 20% of the words that learners know, even after studying for years and years, right? So if you don't know the tones for these words, whenever it comes time to say those words, you're going to have difficulty producing those tones accurately. So that's going to lead to these unsystematic tone errors that I talked about before. So just, this is not so much research, but more my guess that if we wanted to talk about pronunciation in L2 Mandarin, we would describe consonants and vowel errors as tending to be systematic, Whereas when we talk about tones, we're going to tend to see more unsystematic errors. And that's important because these systematic errors are something that a listener can potentially learn, right? If you hear me say 路师 10 times, you're going to figure out that when I say 律师, I mean 律师, right? But if every time I say it, I use a different tone, it's going to be quite challenging. Yeah, it's going to be quite challenging for you to figure out what the pattern is because there is no real pattern. The pattern is I don't know the tones. Right? So that brings us to the listeners, right? What do these types of errors and pronunciation problems or accented pronunciation that learners have, how does that impact listeners? And one thing we know kind of more broadly from research on speech is that listeners use everything they can to understand what they hear. So in Mandarin, when we typically talk about syllables having an initial, a final, and a tone, and under normal circumstances, listeners are going to use all of that to interpret what they hear. So here I'm just showing it as kind of like a balanced percent, right? Initials, finals, and tones all get equal attention. But it could be possible that as listeners hear kind of accented initials or finals, they might start actually to rely on tones more. Right, so if a learner speaks with a very strong accent on the consonants and vowels, that might push the listener to rely more on the tones if the tones are clear, right? When we think about our learners in the early stages, tones are often very strange or weird, but over time, most learners tend to get pretty good at producing the tones in like reasonably clear fashion, right? But what they still do is make those unsystematic errors. And unfortunately, it may be the case that this would push if they have an accent on the vowels and consonants, this could push listeners to rely on those tones, even though the tones are not a very good thing to trust when it's coming out of the mouth of the L2 speaker. Right? On the other hand, it could be that if the basic pronunciation of initials and finals is very strong, then listeners will rely less on tones. Okay. Uh, But in general, what we're dealing with for accented L2 speech is that everything, right? Everything sounds a little bit different. And so it's going to be up to the listener kind of very flexibly and in the moment to figure out what part of that speech is most useful, and probably they're going to rely on context to do that. So all of these problems, which seem rather extreme if we're looking at just a single syllable, start to look much less extreme once we actually talk about real communication where there's a message and context to clarify things. But first, focusing on this isolated situation, we do have research that suggests even under normal circumstances in Mandarin, if you hear a single syllable, it's actually the case that listeners rely more on the final, right? They rely most heavily on that final information rather than tones or even the initials. Again, none of this means that tones and initials aren't important, but just that there may be a natural bias among listeners to pay more attention to other things. And that can be good news for our learners if they're having problems with tones. Right? There's also some research that uh, in a different way suggests that tones may be less important than others in terms of conveying the impression of accent. I'm not going to go into details on that tonight. Um, a lot of other research that we have so far is just kind of confirming things that we probably would have thought to be true already. Right. So one thing that we found from Yang Laosh's research is that tone errors can cause word confusions, right? accented tones or these kind of unsystematic tone errors can cause people to make transcription errors. So Yang Laoshi created these kind of special ingenious sentences like wu an ying xiu fei ji and wu an ying xiu fei ji, right? Which use just one tone and also have these prosodic breaks, right, between an ying and an ying, right? And had both native Chinese and L2 learners produce these sentences and then played those recordings to native Chinese listeners who then wrote down what they heard in Chinese or in Pinyin if they weren't sure. And it did turn to be the case that the L2 speech, which was accented, which had some tone errors, produced more transcription errors for the listeners. So again, this shouldn't be surprising to us, right? Accented speech is compared to standard accented speech, foreign accented speech is more difficult. And tone errors in particular can mislead, especially when context is not so helpful, right? Um, Another kind of obvious thing from research in a study I did, we used a technique where people hear a word and then see a word. So for example, they might hear 能力 and then see on the screen 能力 or maybe a different word. And their task was just to say if what they saw on the screen was a real word. Right? And sometimes we had kind of nonsense two characters together which weren't a word. And what you expect is that when they hear a word and then see the same word, they will respond very quickly. And they did, right? But what was interesting is when we added some tone errors, so instead of 能力, the speaker would say 能力, right? Then people were a bit slower to respond. Even though that happened repeatedly over the experiment, they stayed kind of consistently slower in responding to those words. This again is not a big surprise, right? But it does indicate that tones are important, and the tone errors, like other types of errors, can slow people down in recognizing words. Another thing about tone errors is that they seem to be associated with foreignness, right? So in that study that I did with these words, right, where they heard a word and then saw the word, we had two L2 speakers produce those words. And for each speaker, they heard both of those speakers. One of the speakers would make errors and one wouldn't. And then the next person, that would be switched so that between these two speakers across all the participants, everybody heard both speakers make errors or not make errors an equal number of times. At the end of each experiment, we would have them rate the accent of the two speakers. And what we found is that when a person didn't make tone errors, their accent in Mandarin was judged to be very light, right? They were a lot of 2s and 3s here. In contrast, when they made lots of tone errors, we see the opposite pattern. So people tended to judge them as having a very strong foreign accent. This isn't a perfect measure. We didn't do anything ever with the consonants or vowels. We didn't change them in the study. So they couldn't really have a major impact on these ratings. The only thing that could have an impact was tones, but it had a very strong impact. Right? So I think we can say with confidence that for many Mandarin listeners, for many native Chinese, hearing lots of tone errors in a speaker's speech tends to suggest to them that that speaker is a foreigner. Finally, any of these pronunciation errors, whether it be tone or vowels or consonants, can increase the effort that people need to expend to understand what's being said. I did another study, more complicated than I don't want to go into all the details here. It was we measured brain responses as people listened to sentences like 这道菜我们每次招待客人的时候都做, where we would swap out 客人 with either a tone error like 客人 or a rhyme error like 故人 or a completely different word 杂志. And in the brain responses, what we see is that in particular, this light blue line is what happens when there's a correct word, when they have, whoops, the expected word. But when they hear one of these mismatches, either the tone or the vowel, the rhyme, we see this kind of drop in the line here, right? Which one way to interpret that in this type of study is that it's an indication of an increase in effort for understanding what's been said, right? So in a sentence like this, where it's very predictable, 我们每次交代 probably going to be 客人, right? Then people are probably able to figure out what 客人 is, or even 库人, but it takes a little more effort, right? Again, this is not surprising, but it's something useful for us to think about when we're trying to think about the importance of pronunciation, that the better the pronunciation is, the less effort it is for the listener. In all of these cases, right, context helps. So when we think about tone errors in particular, context is really important. If I just say a word to you like my, that probably means nothing. You have no idea what that is. But if I say it in a sentence, even if that sentence has entirely bad tones, like 我想去超市买菜, right? You can figure out what that my is because there's context. Studies have been done where people wipe out the tones or have just one pitch across a whole sentence and have people transcribe those sentences. And people can generally do quite well with those sentences as long as they aren't overly complex, right? So context can really help people recover meaning. And for the most part, when we're speaking with people, we have even more context than in these experiments because you know what I'm trying to talk about, perhaps, right? If I'm trying to buy something, or we've been talking about what I like to eat or what you want to do on the weekend, right? We know that context, and that all helps us understand. So when it comes to pronunciation and accent, it's not as if any of these things that we've talked about very briefly here are kind of like the end of the story. Context makes all of this easier. So to kind of wrap things up here, as Yang Laoshi said, next week is the more practical talk, but I still want to leave you with some takeaways that you might apply to the classroom, or at least you're thinking about what you're going to do in the classroom. As I said in my little ad, I'm not going to tell you how to teach, but maybe this can help you think about what to teach or what's important in your teaching. And I think the first thing to say is where I started, that foreign accent is normal and not a problem in most cases, right? So if your students sound accented, that is not strange. They are not doing badly at learning a second language. They are completely normal. And as long as they are comprehensible, that's fine. So really one major thing for you to work on is to help them be more comprehensible rather than try to completely do away with foreign accent. Right, and as I said earlier, people also can adapt to accented speech. So even when our learners have rather strong Mandarin accents, foreign Mandarin accents, people can probably adapt to them. What research so far tells us is that tones do not make Mandarin special, right? These things that apply to English also apply to Mandarin, right? That tones do not uniquely make Mandarin accents more difficult than, say, English accents are for native English speakers. Uh, at the same time, all pronunciation matters. There's not one specific aspect of pronunciation that should be taught without paying any attention to all the rest of it, right? The more you can do to strengthen all aspects of pronunciation, the better for your students. But if there are certain things that are causing them problems, then those are, of course, good places to start. So if you notice words like lü that are problematic, then that's some place where you can pay more attention and try and help your students overcome those problems. Right? And for tones, I think in particular to be aware that one of the problems learners have is forgetting tones. So whatever you can do to help them remember those tones, whether that's something as simple as like frequent quizzes that require them to include the tones. You don't have to give them major grade problems if they get those tones wrong, but just lots of opportunities to remember and recall those tones could be very helpful for them. Right. And then finally, I think it's just important to remember what the goals of the students are, of the teachers are, of the program, right? So the learners themselves come to our classrooms with goals. Maybe those goals are very vague. And so you're going to be able to inform them a lot on what might be important as they're learning language. But you know, if some learner really just wants to go to China and be a tourist, then they don't have to master pronunciation to the same level as if a student wants to be a diplomat, right, or run a business in China. But it's also important to think about goals beyond just those of the learner. Also, if you are a teacher and you have other teachers that teach with you, you cannot do one thing while all the other teachers do something different. So it's important for you as a group to think about what are your goals for pronunciation. What are the things that are going to be important and what not. And similarly at the level of program, right? Some specific programs may have very specific goals so that if conversation isn't a major goal, isn't a major component of the program, then maybe all these aspects of pronunciation are going to be less important. So again, keeping these goals in mind and thinking about how they interact with a foreign accent and pronunciation will be helpful in guiding you, right? Uh, that's everything I have for you tonight. As I said, this research is really quite new, and so there is a lot of space for us to fill in answers for new questions in the future. So hopefully if I speak to you again or you hear me again in another 5 or 10 years, there will be a lot more answers to provide. But unfortunately, research is time consuming and difficult. And a lot of times, even though we spend a lot of time, we don't get very clear answers. So you will have to depend as much on your own experience as on the research in many cases. And you shouldn't feel bad about that, but when you can learn about the research and if it's helpful, you should definitely use that as much as you can. So that's all I have to say for this evening. Thanks to everybody who makes my research possible, colleagues at Penn State, and especially at Beishida Da in Beijing, who have helped me a lot in this work. So, yeah.
好，我们谢谢周老师啊，让我们学到很多最新的这个，特别是 ERP 这些 psycholinguist 的一些研究发现。好，我们现在我们可以讨论提问的时间啊。我们老师如果有问题，可以你自己 unmute 然后来问，你也可以在 chat box 里面来答，好吧？我们大概有不到20分钟的时间。老师们有什么问题？好，胡老师。
嘿，不好意思，您好，谢谢周老师，谢谢杨老师。我有很多问题，我想先问这个好了哈。先问就是说，我们老师在 set goals 的时候，因为我们大部分的老师是大学教1年级的，就是说我们讲到 tones 发音这些是1年级的，我们不知道学生的 goal 是什么，我们不知道他只是想旅游还是想当外交官，所以我们就把他们 presume 他们是想要学得很好。
Yeah.
而且我们也很多老师大概跟我一样，从自己的角度出发，就是很恨当时的英文老师没把我们发音弄好，所以我们就希望我们能把这个转移到我们学生身上，让他们以后不要有这个遗憾。所以我才这么注重发音哈。但是好像我发现很多美国老师教中文的老师觉得这种心态不见得是对学生特别好，是不是这样？
Yeah, well, I think I certainly don't question anybody's motivations, right? It's not about motivations. The teachers are almost always working in what they perceive as the interests of students. But from a cultural standpoint, and then I think also from a research standpoint, research on pronunciation just repeatedly says, one, adults are not going to get rid of a foreign accent, right? They will have some degree of foreign accent. Two, that doesn't cause problems in most cases. But those points don't mean that pronunciation isn't important. As a teacher, teaching pronunciation is very important. And so everything you can do to help them improve is going to be great for them, right? The better their pronunciation, the smoother their conversations with people will go, the better the impression that people have of them will be, right? So something that I didn't talk about, because there's no research at this point, is kind of that, we say subjective impression, right? Where the listener hears you and forms some impression of you, an opinion, right? We don't have research on that at this point. We do know from the English research that sometimes those impressions people have can be very negative, right? So they hear an accented speaker, they have no problem understanding them, they still have a negative impression. I mean, that's very sad. For one, there's not much we can do to change their impression, right? But if we can help students overcome some pronunciation difficulties, that's going to be good for them. So none of this is meant to say don't focus on pronunciation, don't help people improve, but just be realistic about it, right? Help your students be realistic about it. You be realistic about it. That perfect native-like pronunciation is probably not achievable for most people, right? And yeah, just keep that in mind as you go about the work of doing whatever you can to help, you know, yeah.
好的，好，谢谢。
周老师，你看这个 chat box 有一位老师问，永林老师，你可以读一下。
看不到。
What
chat
are
box.
what are chat box? What are some of your future research questions?
So
Yeah.
right now, I guess I can escape maybe I can see the chat box if I stop sharing the screen here.
Oh yeah, that's
yeah. Now I can see it. Okay. So I am right now I'm working on a project where we're seeing how, so I've talked about how people adapt, right? If they hear people speaking with an accent. And on the slides, I pointed out this kind of unsystematic tone error. And in theory, it's not going to be very easy to adapt to an error if there's no pattern. So that's one thing I'm working on right now, is trying to understand if and how people adapt when they hear a speaker who makes lots of tone errors. And so far the answer seems to be, so by adapt in this case, what we would think they'd have to do is ignore tones, right? So if you hear me make all the tone errors like in the world very quickly, repeatedly, you may just start to say, look, his tones are terrible, I'm gonna ignore them. But it's not, even if you as a teacher maybe can come to that ability, normal people may not be able to do it very quickly. And that's what the research I've done so far seems to suggest, that unless we make it really extreme, like a speaker makes errors on 4 out of every 5 words they say, and those words are very clearly the same, people don't tend to ignore tones. So that's kind of the main project I'm working on right now, is looking at that and trying to understand what these unsystematic errors mean, both for theoretical, psycholinguistic reasons, but also for practical reasons for teaching and learning. In the long run, I do hope to do something more classroom-based, more relevant for learners. But right now, the money that I have is for this other type of research. So, you know, and I don't have all the time in the world. So that's what I'm working on, especially these days. Also working on another project with Jiang Liu 老师, And we're working on looking at how Vietnamese learners who are studying Mandarin, how they deal with some tone stuff. And that's pretty exciting to me to think about not just the English speaking context, but also these tonal language learners who may come with very different challenges when they are learning tones.
李老师也有问题，李老师。
周老师你好啊，谢谢
Yeah.
您的报告啊，非常的，就是非常的有这个科学根据啊。那我想呢，就是我有2个问题，一个问题呢，就是我记得可能有靠近20年以前了，那个时候就是看到一篇文章，就是提到，其实那个文章呢，我想这个它是主要就是说呢，就是一般就是学音乐的人呢，那么他们对于这个带声调的语言，他们的这个认真的程度比较高啊，学得比较好。那么我不知道，就说在这方面的研究，您现在有没有什么新的发现？还有就是我们是不是能够借用音乐，我们怎么样呢可以帮助学生学习？那么第2个问题呢，就是从学习者的角度呢，怎么看纠误的问题？因为我们知道，就是明德的这个风格的话呢，就是有错必纠啊。那么有错必纠呢，其实我们自己的项目，我在杜克工作，那我们的留华项目，北京的项目呢，很多年以前呢，我们做过一份问卷调查。其实之后我们也就一直跟进，很多年我们都在做这个问卷调查，这项目的这个反馈的问卷调查。我们问学生对于我们纠错的这个印象跟反应，他们90%以上，我敢说就是当然就是看也许某些年呢，他可能会学生的程度情况会更好一点，就是呢这个学生的比率就是他们欢迎老师纠错。那么我们也发现，就是有错必纠呢，的确是它有它的效果。但是我们也知道呢，就是也许是从教育心理学啊，或者是现在的一些这个所谓这个更人性化的教学法呀，就是会认为呢，常常纠错会打击学生的信心。所以我想呢，就这一点，想听听看您的看法。
Sorry, some noise there. So the first question was about music and how musicians might learn better. I think one thing to say about that is that so far, that type of research has stopped at kind of the earliest, simplest stage of learning Chinese. So when it comes to something like you hear ma and tell me, is that tone 1, tone 2, tone 3, tone 4, that type of task, which is really not what we as language teachers are really interested in, right? And whether you can identify that tone, or whether you hear ma and ma, can you say, are those the same or different? Musicians, or at least like people with very rich musical experience, are better at hearing those differences. Right? In the long run, that probably helps them, but we don't really know what it means in the long run. Right? So that's one thing to say. But the other is that there is starting to be some research that suggests that something like training general music could actually pay off for students. So there's a little study that just came out by Seth Weiner, where they did this training. They had 2 groups, right? One studied the normal way and one studied tones, and also had a little bit of musical training on the side. And the group that had the musical training on the side did better, right? Again, it's really short, really specific. It's just learning like, a few dozen words. It's again, not really what we do in the classroom, but it is suggestive that, something like learning music. And so if you could encourage people, right, beyond just doing their homework for your class to also study music, great. I don't know how realistic it is to ask students to do something extra beyond just studying, unless we can find a way to make it fun and enjoyable. So I think if they can do it, it seems like music really does have the potential to benefit them, right? For correction approaches, I think there's one thing to, so two things. One is students often say they want to be corrected and then respond poorly when you do correct them, right? Like it really, the 心理打击, right, is real. Like even though they say they want it, they still feel it. It still hurts them. And so depending on your students, their tolerance, their ability to take that correction will differ, right? Some programs have lots of students lined up wanting to study Chinese, and you can make some of them run away, right? And it's okay. Others, you need to be very careful about making your students feel bad, or they will leave your class and tell their friends, and pretty soon you won't have a Chinese program, right? So, you know, it's very much about your circumstances and who you're teaching. And I think college students, of course, are more mature and probably do a better job of dealing with that criticism of their pronunciation than maybe younger students. But even in colleges, you know, it's going to be different. When I taught, not at Middlebury, but in my own classrooms, I had these individual sessions where I would be very picky when it was just me and that student, right? I told them I'm going to be really picky, and I would correct everything. But in the classroom, in front of their classmates, I was very gentle, right? And that was how I handled it. But you know, for each person, it's going to be different. I think for tones, you know, there's only 4 of them, and getting students to produce those 4 tones consistently isn't so hard. I think what's hard is getting them to remember those 4 tones for a huge vocabulary of thousands of words. So in your course today, the vocabulary they learned yesterday and memorized for today is probably not a problem so much, but what they memorized last year and need to use today may be consistently challenging. And especially if it's that language that comes up only once every month or once every year, some word, right, that they need to use, that's going to be hard. So that's where I think the, you know, correction may not be as effective unless the vocabulary comes up a lot. Yeah.
我们还有2位老师好像有问题，一个是李颖杰老师，一个是董志英老师。好，你们2位老师哪位想先问？
OK， 谢谢杨老师。周老师，谢谢你刚才的讲座，非常精彩。So I have a question about your study in 2020 about your students. They hear the sound and then identify the Chinese characters. And your subjects are all adults. Is that correct?
Yes. Yep. All of my research has been with adults so far. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then this acceptance of the foreign accented pronunciation of Chinese. So mainly we're telling our college levels
Yeah.
teachers just be tolerant and know that it's okay for the students within this range, and then we recognize that's okay. But for me, I still feel I feel what Hu Lao Shi's said earlier about our language teachers our incentive and concerns of the beginning learners, especially for K-12 learners. I'm thinking this idea of being just to open our minds and accept that foreign accent in Chinese. I think it's wonderful, but at the same time I have a little concern about let's like open a Pandora's box and then start from there, even K-12, and then the teacher will be like, okay, let's just let them pronounce that as long as I understand these kids, what they're talking about in the context. And then by the time we come to college, and then there is no way we can help with that aspect. So that would be my concern.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I would like to communicate that we should avoid all extremes, right? We should not be extreme in expecting perfection, but we also shouldn't be extreme in just accepting anything, right? Just because you as a teacher understand what your students are saying doesn't mean people outside of the classroom will understand what they're saying. And that's really important to remember as a teacher. I think for me, the first year teaching, at the end of the year, my students did some skits. They loved the class. They loved me. They loved the class. They did these skits. And as I was listening to them do these skits that they had written, in Chinese, I just realized any Chinese person who listened would have no idea what they're talking about. It was incomprehensible. And after that year, I was much stricter, right? My students didn't love me quite as much, but they were much better at Chinese. And so I think, that's just an important thing to keep in mind, that it's not when we talk about these things as research, the point isn't to say that you should do all of one thing or all of another thing, right? There's this reasonable space where we can have differences in emphasis, right? You maybe think tones are a little more important than that teacher, but neither of you should think that tones don't matter. Tones matter, right? Pronunciation matters. And so you shouldn't just abandon the role of teaching, but just be realistic about what are the goals, and don't assume that your own personal feeling about your pronunciation in a second language necessarily is the same as what your students have or will have someday, I guess. So I think one of the main values of research is that it gets us outside of our own experience and helps us see more broadly, is what we think and what we feel we experience in our lives, is that broadly true or not? And it's very rare that we find that there's one very clear answer. Usually, if we study people, there's a wide spread of things that are true, right?
That's
so
true. How do you find a boundary?
Yeah.
周老师，非常感谢你的讲座，还有之前你发表的2篇文章是测试高级汉语使用者的，我读了觉得很有感触。那我想问一个问题，就是你觉得有没有这种可能？因为即便是有很多年的语言经验呢，比如像您这样说汉语说得很好，然后声调也非常准的。但是好像还是有一部分的词是不记得声调，所以也说不出来。那如果老师没有特别的去揪，有些 immersion school 里面的小朋友，那我亲身经历呢，声调也是不太准了，因为老师平时没有特别的教或者特别的改。有没有这种可能？当然他们的程度就会变得很高，很多都是 advanced low 或者 intermediate high 的 speaker， 但是他们的声调是有 systematic 的 problems。所以我有一个 speculation， 就是说有没有可能会引起他们的这种 lexical level 的 fossilization。如果他们不 process 这个 tones， 这就不太有可能有非常强的 tonal information 的 encoding， 对不对？这个想法是不是可行的？
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a lot that we don't really know about this idea of fossilization, right? Whether it's just a lack of learning or a lack of an ability to learn, I think is where a big question comes. And for something like tones, I don't think it's going to be very common to have a person who can't ever correct an error. Like when I have a word that I don't remember the tones for, it's because I forgot them. If you remind me and I can remember them for the next time I need them, then that error has been fixed, right? And the problem is that the number of words that I forget the tones for are thousands, right? So it's not easy to fix them. I don't think there's going to be a quick or magical solution for that, other than just consistent review on the part of learners. And as teachers, if you can just build in kind of a, whenever you have these quizzes, that you take some old words from last month, from last week, from last year, and put them into that quiz, just to help people have a chance to recall what they've learned. That's very powerful, and not just for tone learning, but in general, like doing lots of little quizzes, even though students tend to not like them, they're very effective at helping people retain and hold on to knowledge. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess what I'm asking is just at the conceptualization level, if one does not process the tone, then how can it be encoded? I mean, one has to do both, right?
My current belief or opinion, I don't know, like it's not something, I think this is still an open question, what can happen and what does happen, right? So I think what we see from research so far is that only the words that are extremely frequent, and in the sense that people use them every day, more or less, those words can become so familiar to a listener, to a second language learner, that they recognize it, not because they recognize the tones, but just because they know how that word sounds, and the tones are part of how that word sounds.
Right.
But there are so many words that aren't that common, and for those words, I don't know if there's a good solution, right, in the short term.
Other than, so the explicit instruction definitely help. But I'm saying, what I'm trying to get to is the categorical perception cannot be there. If we have thousands of words missing tonal information, how is it possible that we have that kind of native-like perception?
So I think that the answer is we don't have native-like perception. If by perception we mean like hearing that speech stream coming in and using the tones as I'm hearing it, right? I don't think we do. And I think many L2 learners never will develop that because they just don't have enough experience with the language, right?
Thank you.
I think the only answer for overcoming that is more experience, right? More listening, more hearing, more reading. But I think theoretically, right, I don't think that that L2 learners necessarily develop native processing. Yeah.
If that's not a goal, I think it's less stressful but I agree that intelligibility is the goal. But like you said, if we do not articulate the assessment, do not really feature what kind of pronunciation we want in the assessment, then we can very easily slide to, as long as I understand you, you're fine. I don't have to correct your tone. And at some point, what I noticed that my students at intermediate low level, they started not being able to pick up words in the speech. They started to really hurt for listening comprehension. So that's when I get very concerned, but we don't have the time to correct them at that point without disrupting the communication.
Yeah, I think, finding a way to make listening feature more strongly in our teaching and our materials is really an important long-term goal. Okay. None of us can solve it overnight, but I think that, it's kind of the old input hypothesis stuff that just hearing more of it is going to be good for you.
Well, but they have to be paying attention to the tones, and they don't know how. If it wasn't the routine from the very beginning, that's when they really get stuck. That they can't pay attention to the tones and use that to differentiate words. So they can't bootstrap themselves to get to where they want to be in terms of, listening is hard enough. And then you have this tone thing that tripped you up every 5 seconds. All right, thank you very much.
OK， 谢谢董老师。我们时间不多了。刚才针对这个董老师的问题呢，我可以做个广告。23号刘江老师讨论的是怎么把这个声调教学变成我们 syllabus 的一部分。所以呢，我觉得那个讲座会对您的问题有一些帮助您。
谢谢。
所以有时间可以关注我们另外一个报告。好，我们现在时间不多，我们只有最后一个问题。 其实刚才张恒老师的问题已经回答过了，张老师你满意吗？然后
谢谢，先让别的老师问吧，以后有。
好 ，OK，那我们再请 Thomas 王老师，您问最后一个问题，好吧？
好，谢谢。我是这样考虑的，就是作为这个普通话汉语有这个有发声调的这个要求，不是一个这个语言的是一个就是附带的一个部分，而是一个机制。这个机制呢是不可缺少的，因为在中文里面，特别是普通话，它的发音素很少。There aren't that many different sounds in a word, and the words are mostly very short. 所以这个声调是一个在用口头说话的时候必须要有的声调，不然的话，中文就是在很大的程度上，除了那些就是日常用语以外呢，就很容易混淆概念，不容易这个互相准确的沟通。所以说，作为这个我们中文老师呢，像我这样从这个中文的环境里长大的这样老师呢，对这一点就是认识的比较所谓深刻一点。那么，所以说我们在教的时候就意识到呢，如果说是声调教不好的话，中文就等于没学好。所以说这个呢，我也可以理解为什么不是中文这个母语为中文的老师在这方面可能不是非常注重的，是因为大部分其实教中文的非中文母语的老师教的时候呢，他们自己其实学得很不错的。像您这个周老师，你这个发音和这个声调都不错，那就在我们所面对的学生而言呢，很少能够将来会成为像周老师这样的成为中文的这个专家、教师。他们呢，对语言的学习呢，在一定程度上呢就卡住了。怎么卡住呢？可能就是因为他的发音和声调，使他们学的不少的中文不实用。就是跟别人对话的时候，听中文的时候听不懂，也没法交流。这一点呢，我觉得我这些年我自己在总结的时候、研究的时候，也总结出来，这其实是非常重要的一点。在美国推广汉语教育这一方面，如果疏忽的话，就是发展不深，就是面铺不广。一定要把声调和发音要搞好。而且声调发音搞好呢，其实不是一个非常难的一个工作。我做了一些研究，这方面的这几年有一些成果，今年明年给它总结一下。就是在我们开始教的时候，一定要有这个前面有个老师说的要有错就纠，就是纠正要经常要纠正，但是鼓励一定要跟上，纠正要纠正在点子上，而且要指出什么是很这个有效的这个改进方法。让学生感觉到能够有效的提高，那么同时给他大量的鼓励，这样修正呢，我觉得还是可行的。就这些。
Yeah. The only I don't argue with anyone's personal experience of any of this. So you know, as a teacher, you have your experience and you know what you have succeeded at, and I'm not going to tell anybody to do something different than what they've done that's been successful. But I can tell you that the research so far just suggests that in conversation at the level that's been tested, tones are not, you know, somehow more destructive than other things. And given context, the tones can usually be recovered. But there's still room for more research. One of the things that hasn't really been tested is when tones are not just kind of off, or like I talked about the research that made tones flat, right? Well, that's not really what learners do, right? A learner produces tones in all kinds of incorrect ways that can be misleading, so that you think of the wrong word, right? Instead of saying ma, they say ma, or whatever, right? So we haven't really given enough attention to that type of thing. But my sense from looking at the research, all of us kind of expect that tones are going to be really important, and they never quite turn out to be as important as we thought they would be. So that's all. But there are certainly contexts where tones are going to be really important. Like if you're talking about educated, you know, formal speech where you're using very infrequent vocabulary, maybe things that have like when stuff in it. Like the tones are going to be really important because people aren't used to understanding that language, hearing that language. And so every bit of pronunciation is going to be really important, right? Yeah, so again, my message to you tonight is not pronunciation doesn't matter. Pronunciation is really important. That's why we have this right, special interest group. The point is just the research so far is telling us don't go to extremes. Right? Yeah.
好了，我们现在我们得 wrap up 了，因为时间已经很晚了，我们已经超了大概15分钟。好，再次谢谢我们的周老师，辛苦，也谢谢各位老师利用晚上时间来听我们的报告。我们会把周老师，您介不介意我把这个视频录像分享给大家
？No problem， 可以的。
No problem。OK， 我们会给大家分享我们的这个录像，还有呢，希望大家能够有空参加我们23号的刘江老师的报告。他那个是关于怎么能够在我们的教学当中把声调成为这个 syllabus 一个部分。我知道还有很多老师问问题，那你们可以单独的跟我们周老师联系，可以吧？好，谢谢大家。